Hello everyone and welcome to the Wild Side. This is your host Kight, and that was Linda Ronstadt singing I Fall to Pieces. And the reason I picked that song to start us off today is that I want to discuss some recent scientific research about pieces of habitat, or fragments of habitat as they're known kind of among the researchers who study the effects of different habitat sizes on the individuals that choose to live in those different patches. And this is something that's quite interesting because, of course, we have some areas of land that cover quite a lot of space and other areas of land that cover much smaller bits and pieces. And this is really going to affect the organisms that try to live in those different types of habitat. And as you might imagine, if you've got really large animals, they tend to need larger amounts of space in order to roam around and find places to live and find enough prey to eat. And so if we only leave them with little bits and pieces in which to live, that can cause some real problems. And in fact, that is one of the big issues with things like tigers and in some cases even lions, because these things need lots of space that they can roam around in and look for different prey in. And if we don't leave them this space, then they end up wandering into human areas instead, and that's where they can find themselves eating livestock or eating pets or even attacking humans. And that obviously can raise lots of tensions. But if you've got smaller sorts of organisms that maybe are only using a few feet of space, maybe you're thinking about an insect or a little bit of moss or lichen that's growing on a rock, then that amount of habitat that's available around them probably isn't going to have a really significant effect all of the time. And so there's this real balance and this real interest in figuring out, what amount of space do we need to set aside when we're creating reserves, and especially when we're thinking about cities and having roads and buildings and all these vast areas of habitat that are covered by human structures. How do we work together so that we can have both all of that space that's devoted to human things, but also some space that is useful for habitat, and it's not just kind of a green space that looks pretty but doesn't really contain much that can be utilized by the wildlife. And that is something that was of interest to a couple of researchers who were living in Tokyo. And if you've ever been to Japan or if you've seen pictures of Tokyo, then you know that this is an extremely dense city. And despite the fact that it is, very built up and it has lots of human structures, it does also have quite a lot of parks. And some of these parks are quite small, so maybe they're about 3 hectares in size, but others are much, much larger, so they're almost 800 hectares in size. And as you might imagine, these different sized parks can be host to different types of organisms and different numbers of organisms. And the species that these two scientists were most interested in is something called a raccoon dog. And raccoon dogs are a type of canine. They kind of branched off a long time ago, and they look very much like raccoons, if you're familiar with raccoons, which are native to North America, except that they're just kind of larger bodied and they have longer legs. It's completely a superficial resemblance, but they do look very much like raccoons that just kind of have a dog-shaped body. And these things are omnivores, so they like to eat insects. They will also eat plants. They do kind of prey on other small animals. And so they can do with a lot of different types of habitat as long as it has some combination of the plants and animals that they like. And they're generally considered to be quite happy living in human disturbed areas, and you can find them in backyards, you can find them in these parks. And people didn't really think there was too much to worry about with raccoon dogs. They thought they were going to do pretty well in these urban habitats. And it is important that they do well because these guys can disperse seeds, and so they will eat these plants and then kind of leave little seeds in their scat, and those seeds will then sprout and kind of regenerate the forest. So they are quite important in building the structure of the habitat. And they also are predatorial on insects, especially beetles, and these are things that humans might not want to have around near them. They also can be very destructive to vegetation. So it's good to have the raccoon dogs keeping these other species in check. So if they aren't around, then kind of sustainably managing these ecosystems can be quite difficult. So it's in our interest to make sure that these dogs, these raccoon dogs, are quite healthy. And so these researchers were thinking, well, what we want to know is, does it really matter what size the habitat fragment is that these guys are living in? We know that we have really small habitats and we also have really big habitats, and is that going to affect whether or not these raccoon dogs can utilize the space, and also whether or not they're going to breed there and kind of sustain their populations. And in order to look at this, they had a bunch of video cameras that they stuck out through the forest where these guys live. And I don't know if you guys have ever seen footage or photographs from these camera traps, but it's really cool. We actually took some of these with us to Kenya earlier this year, and it's amazing the stuff that you don't know is anywhere near you. And then you look at the footage from the camera traps and you can see these animals that have been rummaging around right behind your tent, right next to the path that you use to go to the toilet in the middle of the night. And they were there all along and you just had absolutely no idea. And that was exactly what these scientists were able to do with the raccoon dogs. So they were able to just catch these things going about their daily business and foraging for food, wandering around with their partners and with their young. And overall they were able to get about 450 different photographs just within a couple-month period. And they chose to set these things out between June and August. And this is a really important time for the raccoon dogs because they give birth in May, and then the pups are with them throughout the middle of the summer, and then they disperse in September. So by focusing on June and August, they can look at the raccoon dogs when they should have their young in tow. And so if they have a lot of photographs from a particular site and they never see any pups, then that's pretty good evidence that that site is not good enough for breeding, or that something is going on in that site so that the raccoon dogs aren't able to do what they should be doing, which is propagating, having more young, and keeping the population going. So the researchers did this in a total of 21 different forest patches, and all the patches were kind of bounded by major roadways, so things that are over 4 lanes across, sometimes even much bigger than that. So that really does effectively kind of, make sure that that really is a patch that's an independent patch, has nothing to do with the other patches nearby. However, they also knew that sometimes there can be an effect of having kind of lots of little patches versus a couple large patches in an area, because sometimes the organisms can disperse across the road, they can migrate into new areas, and this can allow them to kind of utilize multiple different spots when they're foraging or when they're looking for a place to breed or to den and that sort of thing. And so they not only wanted to see how big is the patch in which they're doing the camera traps, but how much forest area total is within about 600 meters of that place that they're photographing. So what they're asking here is, what's the effect of the local habitat, excuse me, and what's the effect of the landscape habitat? And that's a really interesting question because it's really kind of the landscape level that can have a lot of management regimes. When you're thinking about urban planning, you often don't have people deciding exactly what's going in each little slot on a map, but they will say, okay, this area over here, we're going to let that all be housing, this area over here can be industrial, and so on. So that's often the level at which we're making decisions when we go in and do urban planning. So once they had all these photographs that they could analyze, they were able to see who is in the photograph, whether it's an adult by itself or an adult with young, and then they're able to calculate all the times that they observed animals in order to estimate the probability that they were able to capture all the animals and how many actual raccoon dogs likely lived in those habitats. So they were able to calculate something called the probability of occurrence within a certain area, and also the detection rate. So how many of the things that were living there were they likely to have captured with their photographs. So when they looked across their 450 so photographs, what they found was that there were adults in every single forest patch. And so obviously there was quite a high probability of occurrence because they are in fact present in every single habitat patch, no matter how small or how big it is. And this was kind of expected because these raccoon dogs are extremely common in Japan, and specifically in Tokyo. And their estimates suggested that they were able to detect about 62% of all the adults that probably do live there. So actually, even though they saw lots of pictures of these raccoon dogs, there were probably many, many more that they just didn't capture on the photographs. And when they did the analysis, kind of linking the number of animals that they saw with the habitat factors, they found that really the landscape level factors didn't really have any impact on how many adults they saw. It didn't really matter how much forest was within 600 meters of the patch. What really mattered was how big the patch was itself. But even that didn't seem to have a very big effect on whether or not the adult raccoon dogs were going to be there. So in other words, these raccoon dogs were pretty happy to just go wherever they could find a bit of forest and forage there. This, however, was not the case with the pups. So when they looked across all the photographs, they only saw pups in about 62% of all the patches. And they think that probably this did capture about all of the pups that there actually were. So there may have been about 4% or so of patches that did actually have pups that they weren't able to see in the actual photographs, but more or less that's about how many they saw. So about 2/3 of all of the sites did actually have pups being produced at them. And this is quite a bit lower, obviously, than the 100% that was found for adults. And they found that, they probably didn't detect all the individuals at each site either, so they maybe detected about 1/3 of all the pups within each site. But even if you take this and kind of calculate up and determine how many pups there probably were, based on these estimates, that's still not a pup for every single adult or pair of adults, and it's still not a pup at every single site, which means that there are forests in which these animals are not producing a next generation. And that, of course, is a very bad thing if you want these things to keep reproducing and generating more of themselves for the future. And what they found when they analyzed the relationship between the presence of these pups and the habitat variables is that it's the local environment that's having a really strong effect on whether or not there are pups. So again, the landscape doesn't seem to have any major effect. The amount of forest nearby is not really influencing the presence of pups, but it is the size of that local habitat patch. And what they specifically found was that only in the bigger patches were the adults producing the pups and breeding. And this seems to suggest that even though the adults are quite happy to go to these smaller habitats and to forage there, that it's somehow that type of area is not good enough for them to breed in. Now maybe that's because they need to have a large area over which to roam each day, so they like to patrol a big area around them in order to make sure that they feel nice and safe, that they aren't going to be attacked by any predators or other raccoon dogs. Maybe that's because they like to eat ground beetles preferentially, and these beetles are lower in number in areas that are smaller, maybe because there's a connection between kind of the amount of habitat area and the amount of beetles that can be sustained, or the edge effects of living near a highway and being exposed and the number of beetles that are there. But whatever the case is, food resources can really impact breeding success, so where there are lower numbers of beetles, then you might expect that there are going to be lower numbers of raccoon dogs, and so that could be impacting the presence or absence of the breeding activity in these smaller areas. Now another major question is, why didn't that larger landscape variable have a big impact? And we know from previous studies that definitely having a lot of space around you that's kind of related to your habitat is quite useful. So if you live in a little fragment of forest and you have lots of forest nearby, that can be really nice because it means you might have an influx of fellow species mates from that other habitat. It might mean that that other habitat has some kind of an influence on the flow of nutrients or energy through the environment, and so that impacts you where you are. So actually they might have expected that this larger landscape variable would contribute to how the raccoon dogs use the little habitat patches that they're living in. The fact that this wasn't the case suggests that maybe those big roads that were bounding all of those habitats were having a really big effect. So perhaps they can't migrate out and other things can't migrate in because those roads are so massive and they kill lots of raccoon dogs. And in fact, researchers do know that hundreds of thousands of raccoon dogs can be killed each year as roadkill. They can be found along the road. And so even though they theoretically can go from one of these patches to another, in reality, every time they try to do it, they don't end up making it. And this can really affect the population dynamics and decrease a species' persistence. And so what the authors have taken away from these results, not just specific to the raccoon dogs themselves, but in general, is that we might need to consider how to arrange forest patches and urban patches in general whenever we are trying to foster the growth of populations in urban areas. So we need to connect patches, certainly, and not just isolate them with roads all around them so that animals can't get out and go somewhere else if they want to. Or perhaps we could place them much nearer to each other so there's not a big space in between, such that even if they do cross a road, maybe they then run into a neighborhood or an industrial estate, and so they just can't make it to that next habitat fragment. And of course, this is something that should be thought about long before all of the disturbance really begins and all the construction really begins, because if you've got a whole bunch of buildings and roads already in place, it's going to be very hard to kind of retroactively refit it so that the environment is useful for the habitat as well as for the humans, and as well as for the wildlife that are living there. And the authors point out that this kind of forethought, and I'm quoting now, can be crucial for preventing biodiversity loss worldwide and also for managing forest ecosystems and urban landscapes. So kind of the point of that story is that these organisms can really survive when they're living in our habitats, but we have to make sure that we kind of arrange things to really optimize it for them and allow them to be self-sustaining in those areas. And that was Jack White with Missing Pieces, and you are listening to The Wild Side on Source 96.1 FM, and I'm your host, Caitlin Kight. And today I'm kind of all over the place with my topics. I'm just talking about some recent scientific literature that I have been reading. And the last study I talked about was an actual study that was performed by some researchers who had specific questions when they set out. They went to a particular environment and looked around there. But the one that I want to talk about now is actually something called a review article, and that's an article where someone goes to the pre-existing scientific literature and looks to see what it has to say and kind of synthesizes across that to kind of see what the major trends are and what people are thinking about a particular topic. Excuse me, the allergies are really kicking in lately, so I'm sorry for all the coughing and sniffling. So this review article that I want to discuss is something that thinks about whether or not humans should have more of a presence within nature reserves. And this is something that is a bit of a tricky issue because a lot of us tend to think about nature as being something that's kind of other than human. So when we think about a natural preserve or a park or any kind of natural area like that, we think about a place that's basically untouched by humans, and we want to go into it and not really see any other evidence of people except for our own selves as we pass through it and kind of look around at the nice, pretty habitat. And a lot of people say that this actually is an idea that stems back to John Muir, who was out west in the Americas, and he loved how peaceful and quiet it was and how he could totally get away from people and be way out in the wilderness and not see any other soul or any kind of building or road or any evidence of humans. But actually that's kind of a fallacious opinion of what nature is, because if you think about it, humans have been around for thousands and thousands of years doing various human things, and many of those things involve kind of managing the habitat in some way or another. So for example, the habitats that Muir was in were quite actually managed by Native Americans. So they would go in and do things like coppicing, trimming of certain parts of plants so that they would grow back next year in a different way or in a greater abundance so that they could harvest things. They would often collect seeds from things and then spread them around, and so they would deliberately create big meadows of wildflowers, for example, or big stands of berry bushes and things like that. So all of these things that Muir was talking about as being quite natural were in fact, in many cases, man-made, or at least man-influenced, and he just didn't know the difference. And that actually is not far off the truth for a lot of places that humans tend to think of as being quite natural, because these are habitats that people lived in at some point or another and engaged with in some way, whether that was from harvesting plants or harvesting animals or just pitching a tent there occasionally and living or hiding out in a cave. And so some people are increasingly arguing that, when we think about managing these habitats, we need to remember that humans are also a natural part of the world's ecosystems, and we need to make a space for them, and we need to be practical in thinking about the fact that, we want something from the landscape, and we want to preserve it, but we need to find a way to preserve it that kind of allows us to do what we want and need to do, but also allows the ecosystem to function in kind of a natural way, whatever that means, or a kind of a healthy way so that it can keep on perpetuating itself over time. And so one of the things that people are now proposing is that we go in and allow people who have animals, for example, livestock, to go in and graze those animals within natural parks so that they can kind of mimic the activities of the herbivores that would have been there before people killed them off. So a great example of this is out in the American West, where there used to be just hundreds of thousands of bison that would roam around and eat all of the grasses there. And of course, early Americans managed to kill all of those off, astoundingly, despite the huge size of those herds. And then all of a sudden there weren't these herbivores anymore, and the grasslands became totally different because they were no longer held in check by those big herbivores. And so they kind of went crazy, and that allowed fire to come in and have big impacts because all of a sudden there was now all this stuff left over that could burn, and it became kind of a disaster in many ways. And so, theoretically, if we were to introduce herds of cattle or goats or sheep that could go have this function that's very similar to the original function of native wildlife there, then maybe that would actually be more natural in many ways than having nothing at all and letting the ecosystem become something completely different in terms of how it looks and also how it functions. And other techniques might also include cutting wood, so periodically going in and thinning out some of the tree stands, or allowing certain grasslands to grow up so that we can go in and hay them and cut down all that grass and carry it out. There are various different sorts of methods that have been proposed to be used in these sorts of ways. And some people are really against this. In fact, I recently read an article written by some Australians who were very angry at some recent proposals that logging companies could go in and chop down some trees, and also that people could go in with their cattle and let them graze in natural spaces. And so this is really a contentious issue, but there is a lot of literature, increasingly from around the world, that suggests that some of these methods, if they're used kind of lightly and we don't completely overburden the preserves, could be really useful actually in sustaining the habitat and actually making it a bit more like what it was hundreds of thousands of years ago, before we really started having negative impacts from doing kind of industrial activities like burning fossil fuels and laying roads and all sorts of things like that. So one of the things that's really interesting is that if you go in and disturb certain sites, you can make sure that you're getting rid of dominant species that would otherwise be really problematic. So in the case of the grasslands that I was mentioning in the US, if you've got certain species of grass that will kind of exclude all the others and grow really fast and grow really big and shade other species out, then you can make sure that if you get rid of those, they aren't going to dominate, and that allows the other species to come out and flourish as well. And this is also true of little shrubby things. So often in habitats you'll have things like goats and sheep that will love to eat the little shrubby things that start to grow and develop into kind of hedgerows and trees. And if you get rid of those things, then you don't have the shade that's created, and you don't have these things that will take over and eat all the nutrients. And that means that you get more things like wildflowers and little plants that are kind of close to the ground. And all these things can have a big contribution in terms of how the ecosystem functions, because they can allow other organisms to eat them as food. They can offer space for other organisms to live under them or on top of them. And it can just be really useful, in particular for these rarer species that are then kind of released from that pressure and that interaction with these dominant things. And another issue that has been raised is the fact that if you do have herbivores that are in there eating these foods and processing them in their guts, then as they move through the habitat, they're going to be distributing the seeds in their scat. So kind of like what I mentioned for the raccoon dogs in Tokyo. So if you do have lots of herbivores in the habitat, then they're going to be naturally spreading the seeds out as they go, and you're going to get patterns of growth that are potentially more natural than if you just had a big stand of something that just continues to spread throughout the whole habitat to the exclusion of other stuff. So you might have herbivores that are picking up some of those rarer seeds and distributing them farther abroad so that they can then propagate and become more abundant in the habitat. And one of the interesting things that some researchers have noticed is that actually when a lot of preserves were originally established, we did in fact have lots of people that would do these sorts of things and fulfill these sorts of functions within those areas. So in the Americas, for example, we still had a lot of native tribes that were living in preserves, and they were allowed to do a kind of low-level grazing of cattle or harvesting of foods, and this was not considered a problem. And in fact, this is still the case in some places in the far north, where you've got indigenous tribes that will harvest things like whales or seals in some areas. And this was not really bothersome to people early on, but increasingly we've become really intent on removing all signs of humans in these areas. And this can be a real problem when you think about the fact that we now also have people who are looking for places to live and they don't have places. So this is a really big issue, for example, in Africa, where we tend to exclude everyone from these massive preserves and push everyone out to the edges, and then they're all kind of fighting over the space that's left and trying to have enough to farm or to take their cattle out to graze, and they're just kind of bumping into each other, and they're bumping into increasing urbanization, and there's just not enough space for people. So if you do allow some intermingling, then potentially that also solves these problems of where are we going to put everyone and where are we going to put everyone's crops and animals. Now, another thing that can be solved by potentially kind of integrating preserves and just regularly used space is the fact that often we have big areas that were once used for one purpose or another, and they're suddenly abandoned. And this can be frequently found with agriculture. So right now we tend to have agricultural methods that are really focused on using lots of fertilizers and lots of chemicals, and we use crops that take a lot out of the soil, and at some point sometimes the soil just can't sustain them any longer. This is actually something that I was talking a little bit about last week when I was mentioning that kind of ecological gardening movement. Now, when this happens, if you do have areas that suddenly become not very sustainable, they're not really good at preserving crops and allowing crops to continue because they've just been leached of all of the nutrients that they need, then people will often leave and then just go elsewhere. And this can be a real problem because then these big tracts of lands are just taken over by whatever species are able to live in those conditions. And often these are not the greatest species. They're invasive things that are just very hardy, or they're species that wouldn't ordinarily have been there in the past, but suddenly they do very well there because they can kind of take advantage of this situation and proliferate. And you just don't really have that kind of natural integrated system that would have been there in the past and worked well with the ecosystems around it and offered space for organisms to live in. And a great example of this is something that happened in the former USSR. So there were lots of farms there that were suddenly abandoned whenever it became the Soviet Union and all the other countries disbanded and became their own entities, and it was no longer farmed communally, all of that space. And so a lot of areas were abandoned as people went elsewhere for different types of jobs, and then suddenly there was this space that was completely devoid of nutrients, and all of a sudden all these other things started growing there that weren't really the healthiest things for the land or for the wildlife that should have been in abundance there. And so if we were to think about some way to incorporate these areas into preserves and figure out a way to kind of make them useful as both preserves and as agricultural land, which they once were, they're kind of set up to be. If we can find a way to kind of do both of those things simultaneously, then that could be really advantageous, because you could kind of use some of these traditional management techniques that were used by those early people that once were able to kind of inhabit these spaces and strike the balance between kind of nature and also preserving the land and letting it sustain itself while getting something from it. And you can use those techniques to then maybe get some farmers some jobs, allow them to create food for themselves, but also put this land back into a healthier kind of natural condition. And this is really the interest of these researchers who are doing all these studies, is not to just stick people in preserves for the sake of putting them there, but figuring out how we can, kind of ease the tensions between what humans want and what conservationists want for nature, and figure out a way to use some of these less invasive techniques and these less extreme techniques of allowing people to co-inhabit with all these other wild organisms. So some of the things that they're introducing are those very things that I mentioned way back at the beginning, So things like coppicing and sowing of seeds and kind of going into certain patches and taking out a harvest but leaving other patches behind. And a lot of preliminary evidence suggests that actually this does work pretty well. So there are certain places like Yemen and Chile and Australia that have all responded really well to various levels of kind of traditional management techniques being introduced into preserves. And the people there are benefiting from this because they can utilize that space, they aren't excluded from it, but the wildlife is also doing quite well. And this has been found in different types of ecosystems as well, not just different countries. So coral reefs and forests and grasslands, quite a wide variety of habitats. Now, some of this stuff has also been studied kind of nearby. So in Scotland, for example, there was a study that was examining what would happen if we were to introduce some grazers into these preserve areas. Would they kind of help a forest that has grazing space in the understory? Would it help that kind of area revive a bit and become a bit more healthy? And they actually found that no, it wasn't the greatest thing. So it's certainly in some areas and in some types of habitat, these may not be the most useful techniques. But in other areas, they do seem to show a lot of success. And it doesn't just have to be livestock. I know I've mentioned several different species like cattle and sheep and goats. But it can also be things like cutting hay and mowing and doing just kind of low levels of management. So not going in with a big tractor, not going in, putting in a road or a building and making them into really established farms, but just kind of doing minor little things that allow people to be present in the habitat and maybe get something from it, but also allow it to grow on its own terms. And what the researchers who did this review were suggesting actually was that we kind of make a database of all the different types of techniques that have been used in this way and all the different types of habitats in which they've been used and all the different benefits and also drawbacks of all of them, and just pick from that database and kind of look at the situations in each preserve as we get to it, and then just pick a management technique and try it out based on whether or not that really kind of matches your habitat of interest. So for example, if we're looking to do something down here in Cornwall, they're suggesting we shouldn't just do what people have done here in Cornwall in the past, but we should think about doing whatever we want to do. If it's worked somewhere else in a similar sort of habitat, why not give it a try here? And that's quite an interesting idea because a lot of people, of course, they don't like the idea of having people in preserves, and they especially don't like the idea of trying something that's not really native to a particular area. So this is kind of thinking outside the box a little bit. And the researchers point out that actually one of the biggest challenges is probably going to be not just studying how this works, and whether it works and to what extent it works, but to just figure out how to sell these ideas to the public and make people think that actually it might not be a bad thing if you go into a park and you see someone walking their cattle through it or mowing a field and taking out the grass. So it will definitely require just kind of, changing all of our minds about what a nature area should be and what we want to get out of the habitat around us. And that was Norah Jones with The Grass is Blue. And I believe that song was originally written by Dolly Parton. It's quite a good one. So I picked that song to kind of finish up on the idea of allowing humans into nature preserves and allowing them to allow their cattle to graze and to let the humans go in and mow as well. But now I want to move on and think about quite a different relationship between humans and the habitat. And that is actually something that I mentioned a little bit in the first study that I talked about today, and that's the effect of roads. And there are lots and lots of studies that have looked at how totally evil roads are for various different reasons. Obviously the fact that they have roadkill, like I mentioned with respect to the raccoon dogs, the fact that you've got cars going along them that end up kind of letting dirt and particles from elsewhere come in, and also toxins from the gasoline and toxins from the oil and other things that fall from the car. Just the physical disturbance of having a car go past or pull off into the shoulder of the road and trample down the grass. The runoff associated with having rain hit it and then trickle down and also carry all these toxins that they pick up from the road surface into the surrounding atmosphere. There are just all sorts of problems that people have with roads. But it turns out that they may not be bad all of the time, and that is the finding of a study that was recently conducted in Spain. And I thought this one was quite interesting because it does kind of turn the whole roads are evil thing on its head a little bit, because it suggests that actually they may create some habitat for certain types of species. And of course, just because they help some species doesn't mean they're going to help all species, but it's always an interesting thing to consider the fact that not everything is black and white, not everything's cut and dry, and sometimes these things that humans do that seem quite bad can actually have unintended positive consequences. And so that's why I wanted to end on maybe this kind of positive note from this Spanish study. So what they wanted to look at was the idea that maybe the verges along roads can be used by certain types of species that like that habitat. So if you think about what it looks like along a road, you've often got kind of, obviously the paved portion, maybe a little strip of gravel or something along the edge where a car can pull over. And then you've usually got some amount of grassy habitat or kind of shrubby habitat before it turns into whatever the surrounding area is, whether that's forest or a desert or whatever the case may be. So there's usually that strip of land in between the road itself and the landscape where you've got kind of those invasive or disturbance-loving shrubby types of things that will live. And obviously that's not necessarily the case down here in Cornwall because we have lots of hedgerows. So you'll have to think about what the road looked like elsewhere when you traveled there last. But this kind of general construction is pretty common around the world, so you do normally find that strip. And that strip is the area that people, these Spanish researchers were thinking maybe would harbor some wildlife. And the wildlife that they thought it might be particularly good for is small mammals. Because small mammals like to have lots of cover, and they like to be where they can access little insects and other sorts of invertebrates, and also some amounts of vegetation. And so these verges potentially would be perfect for that. And on top of the fact that they would have their prey items there, and they could probably quite easily dig down and make little burrows in this kind of gravelly portion of the road, is also the idea that a lot of their predators are not going to be right next to the roadside. So things like buzzards, for example, tend to be scared off from the side of roads, or if they do go there, they tend to become roadkill. And so maybe these little mammals are being released from the pressure of their normal predators, and they're able to live quite well and do quite well in these highly disturbed areas. And that was the idea behind this study. And what they did was they went in and they put out some traps at several different distances away from the road. So they had some that were right next to the road, they had some that were about 500 meters away from the road, and then they had more that were about 1,000 meters away. And the purpose of this was to get an idea of whether the little rodents are doing well just next to the road, or is there kind of a road effect that lasts quite a long ways, or is what's happening right next to the road the very same thing that's happening in the whole surrounding landscape, so really it's not an impact of the road at all. And the species, they just kind of wanted to see what species they could find, and in fact it turned out that most of the time they were trapping wood mice, but there was also another species, the mouse, that they got low levels of, as well as a type of shrew. And I said rodents earlier, but actually shrews aren't rodents, so we are talking about kind of mammals in general. So they looked at how many of these individuals could they trap at each of these different distances from the road, and also what type of individual were they getting. Were they adults? Were they juveniles? Were they females? Were they males? And kind of what was the state of these individuals? Were they reproductively active, or were they not reproducing at all? So again, this kind of goes back to that raccoon dog thing, because what you want to find is reproductively active individuals, not just individuals that are present, but those that are actually going to contribute to the perpetuation of the population in a particular area. So they did this as well as looking at the microhabitat around each of the cages that they set out to capture these things, because there were theories that, these animals are quite small, so they might be very sensitive to quite small changes in the habitat. So if maybe there's a slightly different amount of canopy cover near the road versus farther away, or vice versa, maybe that's what's influencing where the mammals are found, as opposed to the actual presence of the road. So they did also look at the type of habitat where they capture these organisms, and then they were looking at all of the the associations here. So did it matter how close they were to the road? Did it matter what type of habitat there was? And if these habitat things did have an effect, what did they have an effect on? Was it the total number of individuals? Was it the type of individual? Was it the age of the individual? So they're just basically looking at all the relationships here between the habitat, this highly disturbed habitat, and the organisms that they found there. And overall, they did this over a 2-year period, so that's 2 whole population cycles. And small mammals like mice and shrews can have really crazy population dynamics where they might rise and fall quite drastically regardless of what the habitat is like and how it affects them. And so that's why they did a really long study, to make sure that they could actually kind of see whole patterns across the population and not just get some spurious result that was associated only with the kind of conditions that particular year in that particular population. So they did this 2-year study and captured 1,000 individuals, and the bulk of these were wood mice. So a lot of their studies, a lot of the analyses, they could only perform on wood mice because they just didn't have enough of the other individuals to really do solid investigations. And what they found was that there were more mice and shrews right next to the road than farther away. And this was particularly true in that area right next to the road itself, but also there seemed to be some trend within that 500-meter band as well. So the road might have had effects all the way up to 500 meters, but certainly there didn't seem to be any big impact at that 1,000-meter mark. So here we already see evidence that there are more of these animals that are near a road than far away. And then they looked even more closely, and they found that there were lots of juveniles that were really close to the road, and this also was something that kind of seemed to extend to that 500-meter band, but there were many fewer juveniles farther away. And this was particularly exciting because juveniles tend to be the animals that are picked off by predators. So they're inexperienced, they aren't very fast, they aren't very healthy, they don't really know what to do if they're presented with kind of a dangerous circumstance, and so they're picked off really easily. They're basically sitting ducks. So the fact that there are lots of juveniles in these areas is not just encouraging because it suggests that there is a lot of reproduction, but also that it does kind of lend credence to that theory that it's a lack of predation that's allowing these animals to do quite well right next to the road. They did find also that the sex ratios and the reproductively active individuals were about the same at all 3 distances from the road, which suggests specifically that it's not just that the only reproduction is occurring right at the road for some reason. If you've got females adequately around in the 500-meter band and the 1,000-meter band, and you've got all these reproductively active individuals at those 2 other spots, then clearly all of the mice and the shrews are breeding in the area, but it's just the juveniles next to the road that are surviving to that stage and being found in those really high numbers. And the researchers looked for the effects of all those microhabitat things that they analyzed. So things like whether the ground was bare or had lots of herby sorts of plants or had scrubby sorts of plants. And those things did appear to have kind of an impact to some extent. But the thing that affected the presence or absence of these little mammals more than anything else was how close they were to the road. So even though there is some slight effect of these other habitat variables, it's really the presence of that road that's having a really major impact on how many individuals can be found there. And this is quite interesting because unlike all these previous studies that have found that there is huge die-off next to roads and animals tend to be scared off and go elsewhere, they actually did find that there are more animals right next to the side of the road than farther away. And this is really exciting because it suggests that actually where we are putting these roads in, there are going to be some species that can be positively impacted. And potentially if we can kind of work it so that we can put in roads in such a way that they don't have negative impacts on other species, we could actually make it so that they are a useful contribution to certain types of habitat. So, for example, if you've got an area where you know that you have kind of a troubled mammal population, small mammal population, then you could insert a road or something that's kind of like a road-like structure in order to help them out. And of course the key to that would be just making sure that you aren't introducing those other negative effects on things like buzzards or other sorts of wildlife. So it is all about balancing these things out. And the researchers suggest that you might be able to do this by thinking about putting in fencing, for example, so that you allow some things to get in but other things to stay away. So you kind of can protect the sorts of species that might become roadkill, for example. Now obviously that's not going to work very well for a bird or something that would be coming in from above, but that's something that could be worked on. So for example, if this is not an actual road that you're putting in, if it is maybe just kind of a ditch that you're going to insert through a nature preserve, then that would work great, because you wouldn't have the cars, you wouldn't have the roadkill issue, but you'd still have that kind of strip of disturbance that would mimic those effects and potentially be useful to the little mammals, because that open habitat might discourage their predators but still be really advantageous to them. And of course these are total guesses. The researchers say you need to do some more studies on these things in order to figure out how to balance all of these things. But it is quite an encouraging result that this habitat feature that we introduced, that's typically thought of as being quite problematic, could, in some cases at least, be useful to certain species. So on that note, I think I've about run out of time today. I'm going to end with Out on the Road, another Norah Jones song, so that's a bit of a trend, I guess. And it would be great to have some feedback from you guys about whether you kind of enjoy the themed shows more, or the shows about recent scientific research more, or if you want maybe a mix of the two. These are actually a bit easier for me to prepare, so I've had to do a couple of these lately because I've been very busy with work. But pretty soon I will be back to full-time being able to devote lots and lots of time to research and put together shows. So I'm happy to do whatever you would like to hear about. So let me know if you have any particular topics that you want to have me explore or explain. Let me know if you like this sort of stuff. And do check out the Wildside website if you want to see pictures and find some links and find out about the songs that I've been playing on the show. So for that, I'll wrap up for today, and I will talk to you next week.